Okay, are we ready to go? Why don't we roll the video? You are never going to believe this, but John and I did not coordinate our presentations this morning. But it just so happens that thinking about these kinds of opportunities the same way, he and I both gravitated to Apple, which has, of course, a fabulous business and a highly profitable business, tracing back from that what to the how. They make great products and have developed a great lifestyle, but the why, that's part of creating a business out of these great technologies and this great talent that you have. Okay, so there we go. So what we want to talk about today, following up on using John's discussion of how to get the hook in the fish's mouth, we want to talk about the business model. What's the business model behind that emotional sale? So how do you develop a successful new business model from your technology, given your talent? And this is my background. I believe that you'll have copies of this presentation to refer to afterwards, and I wanted to make sure that you knew about my firm, Next Vista, and what we do, which is primarily focused on helping large organizations create new business, but on myself, and we talked about this yesterday, but I have not only this entrepreneurial experience, but have worked in large corporations, worked in private equity and venture capital, have done investment banking, and also have a McKinsey consulting background. But thinking about Apple's created an enormous successful business, and a series of them, from the Mac to the iPod to the iPhone. And it's very interesting that we're talking about this today, because today they're introducing the iPhone 6, and it'll be fascinating to see what's actually part of that differs from the 5S. But from my perspective, this started really not with the computer, but with the iPod, which was introduced in 2001. And it wasn't the first. I think John mentioned it's an MP3 player, but it wasn't the first MP3 player. The technology was not really that different from the technology that was on the market, but they had a really innovative business model that involved hardware, software, service, and very importantly, branding. I wanted you to see this Bono commercial because, sure, the iPod was a great piece of hardware, but what they were selling was not the hardware, and it wasn't even the software, the iTunes store, but it was the lifestyle. And that's what John was talking about. We want you to feel the music. We want you to be cool. And yeah, we make a really well-designed iPod, and yeah, it's based on some really cool computer technology, but it's about the coolness. It's about feeling the music. It's about feeling lively and alive in the world. And that's part of this integrated business model. But did they stop there? No, they didn't stop there. That's just one product. And they followed up with the iPhone a half a dozen years later. And similarly, it wasn't the first phone. It wasn't by far, they weren't the first ones who thought about having a small tablet device. I remember doing venture investing back in the early 90s, and people were talking about tablet devices back then. So they weren't the ones who thought up this idea, but what they did was they put together a really innovative, integrated business model. And as this is the Steve Jobs quote that John referred to, not just a communication tool, but a way of life. It was a great device, and it had great touchscreen, intuitive user interface, and what it provided was a series of useful tools that were the apps, and they put together the App Store over the subsequent couple of years, and they forward integrated into retail so that they weren't selling this device or this system through other retailers, but they had their own retail presence. And the way that they developed and managed their products was by constantly reinventing the product itself in a regular schedule. It's literally every 2 years in September. And this, what originally was a high-cost pricing model was evolved to a very different pricing model from what everyone else was offering. And of course, as we've discussed, there was a branding. So the topic then becomes, you know, what is it that really is a business model as different from a technology and a team of engineers, and how do you know what a good business model is? How can you identify opportunities and use analogies to describe what your business and your business model is? And what are some archetypes that people use, like the razor and razor blade model? And then, once you have this business model in mind, how do you develop a strategy, a go-to-market strategy, and a solid investment thesis so that you can get investors engaged in it? And then how do you make that product and that business model into a company by putting all the organizational elements together? So I'm going to go through this really fast. These are a lot of really important topics, and I'm happy to talk about it with any of you afterwards, and I'm sure over the course of the next few days we'll talk about other aspects of this. But you know, it's really about taking your technology and even what you might think of as a product and making a business out of it. So what we want to get to is, what's your business model and how can we help you think about that? So what is a business model? And I'm sorry to read this, but it's important that you get all these ideas. A business model is the description of what an enterprise offers, so what your business offers to its customers, how it creates and delivers value to those customers, and how it makes money. So it's a combination of the target market, who the customer is, and what their need is, or the job to be done. Second, what the value proposition is, so what's the product service offering and what's your approach to that, to pricing that benefit package. Third is, what's the value chain, which is a little bit business school jargon for the resources, the processes, the partners that you engage with, and the channels of distribution that you use to create and deliver that value. And then finally, because it's a business, what are the economics of the business? What is the profit formula? How do you make money doing all that stuff? So the first element of this is figuring out where you want to play. And that's partly the market, you know, the geography, who the customer is, and what is their job to be done. But it's partly, what is the product service offering that gets that job done? So what is it? It could be the product itself, the hardware. It could be the related services. It could be the warranty, for example. It could be how it's delivered. You know, you could have basically a completely different business model. I'm now mentoring a startup in Mass Challenge in Boston that's doing online grocery delivery. It's exactly the same product as going to the grocery store, but it's a different way of delivering that value. And then the pricing, of course. So half of it is the where to play, and the other half of it is, okay, so you've told me where you're going to play, but how are you going to win? Other people, other companies are doing this, but you need to think about, okay, how are you going to deliver that value? What are the steps or the processes that you're using to put together that value package? What are the resources? Who are your suppliers? What are your channels of distribution? And then how do the economics of the business work? And I'm not talking about a P&L. P&L is irrelevant. That's the result. A balance sheet is sort of a statement of some of the financial resources that you have.
John, I think you should spell out P&L and all those acronyms to people.
Okay, so profit and loss statement, or earnings statement. ROFE tree is return on funds employed. And we'll talk about, I'll come back to that. So it's really, what is your revenue? You know, how many of them are you going to sell? At what price? What's your market share? What is your cost structure? What are you spending money on to develop these things and deliver that revenue? Therefore, what are your margins? And then given the assets that you have, how fast do they turn over? How much of an asset base do you need to run that system, that process, and generate that revenue? So there's the where to play, there's the how to win. This first piece defines who your competitors are. When you define what you're selling, you're defining who your competitors are. And this one, this how to win, determines how successful you're going to be relative to those competitors. okay? Now, one topic, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but some startups get hung up on the definition of their core business versus their ancillary businesses. So if you recall the Mass Challenge example yesterday, John's core business is running an incubator in Boston. He runs this accelerator that has a particular system of running a competition on an annual cycle. He described what his core business is. And what he's thinking about now is, if you remember that chart, the adjacencies that he's going into, which are, in effect, new growth platforms for him. And what he defined yesterday were a number of different dimensions that he could pursue to think about what were the most attractive adjacent businesses. So is it international expansion? Is it going into new customer segments like corporate segments? Is it offering new products and services to these startups? Whatever, he described how he thought that through. And one of the really important points for a startup is figuring out what really is your core business, what are your adjacencies, and not getting too ambitious too quickly. John has been very prudent about, yes, let's do international expansion, but let's not do it too quickly, and let's not get a lot of this other stuff distracting us from our core mission, at least until we have the resources and the success behind us that will make us successful. So there's some definitions that you can read. The job to be done, I think, that's basically what is the consumer really trying to, or the customer really trying to achieve. So for example, with this Gazprom example, they're trying to prevent explosions, right? Or with this app development tool, they're trying to develop an app that can work across multiple platforms. The customer value proposition is whatever you're offering that helps that customer get that job done. The profit formula is the economic blueprint. The key resources are the people, not just the people and the money, but the technologies, the facilities, the equipment, and even the brand name is one of your resources that helps you deliver that value proposition to the customer. And then the processes are the means by which all of these resources come together to deliver that value proposition. So you can start, as you think about what how are you going to build this business? What is it that's the job to be done can be a good starting point for figuring out how do you develop this business model. So you can ask yourself, who's the target customer? What's the problem they're trying to address? What circumstances? When do they address this particular problem? What objectives are they trying to achieve? I'm trying to prevent explosions. And what are the barriers that are now getting in the way of them solving that problem for themselves with existing solutions that are on the market? And if you can answer those questions, you might get to an idea about what solutions will satisfy that customer's job, and that will help you develop your business. And I don't want to disregard the opposite way of coming about a solution to a problem and building a company, which is you can actually start with a solution. I have a technology that enables you to do better inspections of your gas pipeline and prevents explosions, and that's a solution to a problem that you have. But you have this technology, you can say, well, what are that solutions or that technology's capabilities? You can say then, what barriers does that technology overcome? What objectives can it address? In what circumstances can it be most effective? And what jobs, can I actually get done? And for whom can I get that job done? And so it's perfectly reasonable to start with the technology, but you have to get yourself through this set of questions, this thinking process, and match it up with this other, what's the job to be done in order to come to a good business idea. Now, from my perspective, when I see new companies that are trying to pitch me, and we see in judging Mass Challenge competitors trying to explain to us what they do, as John said, you really have a very short period of time. They have a very short period of time to describe what it is they do and what job they're trying to get done. And for me, the easiest way to understand that is by way of an analogy. It's like X, but Y. So in some examples here, you know, an iPhone, think of it this way, an iPhone is kind of like a mobile phone, except that it has much broader functionality, it's much easier to use, and I have a completely different pricing model. Or think of a different analogy for exactly the same item, you know, the same iPhone. An iPhone is kind of like a personal computer, only it's really small. And it fits in my pocket, and the user interface is completely different. It's not a keyboard, it's this touch screen. And oh, by the way, I'm integrated with all these app developers and these other, this entire manufacturing ecosystem. So I've created a set of partners that help me put this business model together, and I'm marketing it under a lifestyle kind of a marketing program that's completely different from what Dell uses to market its computers. Or if you're familiar with Amazon, Amazon now is kind of like Walmart, except that it's online and I can search and select what I want. I get the products delivered right into my mailbox, and I rely on affiliates to fill out the long tail of products available. Now Walmart is also doing that, so they kind of caught on. But you know, X is like Y except that Z, and I won't go through all these different examples, but you get the idea. If you can boil your idea, your business idea, down to a, you know, my solution is like X except that Y, that's a very easy way for people to grasp what you're trying to tell them. Now, although there are all these different dimensions of what a business model is, a lot of times one or two or three of the items really capture the essence of what that business model is. And indeed, there are archetypes of business models that have sort of developed over the course of decades. And there's some very famous ones. I've got actually 3 pages. We won't go through all the examples, but I'm sure you're familiar with the razor and the razor blade model, right? Are you all familiar with the razor and razor blade model? Gillette, you know, it used to be back 100 years ago, 150 years ago, people would shave with a straight razor, you know, just basically a blade. And this guy, King Gillette, invented a safety razor that was a fundamentally different product. So it was a different technology that helped users avoid the risk of actually cutting their neck. And so he started marketing it. So it was a fundamental improvement in the technology. But what really made him successful was not that product technology itself, it was the way he priced it. He basically gave people a free razor. And then, because the blades were disposable and you had to buy replacement blades, he sold them the blades, and the blades were very expensive. And so that pricing dimension of that business model is part of what made him really successful. He was also great at advertising. Of course, he had low-cost manufacturing, and he had great channels of distribution, but he became famous for this razor and razor blade model. Similarly, you could have what's called the inverted razor and razor blade model, which you know, the Kodak inkjet printers used, for example, which is you make the item very expensive at the beginning, but then the replacement parts are very inexpensive. Or what Apple did with iPod and iTunes, which is they sold a piece of hardware initially that was very expensive, but the songs that you bought through iTunes were very inexpensive. And so if you think about a consumer buying what had existed before that, tapes or albums, and thought of as very expensive, and all of a sudden they can buy a song for 99 cents, that seemed like a great deal to them. Of course, I'll pay several $100s for the iPod. And so there are all these different archetypes of business models. And you know, here are more examples and more examples, and you can read these afterwards. We won't go through them, but if you can explain your business model by referring to another business model that your customer, your user, is familiar with, or your investors are familiar with, then they'll say, oh, I see, that's just like the razor blade model, I get it. And so you can explain it really quickly, and it will allow you to describe it then in more detail and get to the what's. So that's part of the how. Now, so that's what we've talked a little bit about what a business model is, but how do you know if you have a good business model? What is it? And I think there are three things. You need all three of these, not just two. Two don't work. You need all three. So the first one is, in order for it to be a successful business, it has to be something that's going to make a big impact on the world. It solves an important problem for a large number of customers, and you have to do it in an innovative way. If you're doing something that's the same, that's not innovative, that's the same as everybody else is doing, then why are we doing this? Or if it only is a good solution for a very small number of customers, why do we care about doing this? This is not going to change the world. The second thing is, you need a sustainable competitive advantage. So what you have developed may be good right now, and it may have an advantage for you right now, but if your competitors can copy you, then you have no sustainability and you'll be out of business quickly, and so why bother? So in order for you to have a sustainable competitive advantage, you need to have something that's really, really difficult for anybody to replicate for some reason. It needs to be difficult to supersede. So it could be that they can't really replicate it, but they can make something even better than what you've made. And so you want to prevent that as well. And there are lots of different ways that you can gain this sustainable competitive advantage. It could be proprietary inputs. So for example, if you're a mining company, what China is doing with rare earth metals, they have a sustainable competitive advantage in rare earth elements because they have the only access to the mines for rare earth elements. It could be a technology. You could have a fundamentally fabulous technology that has protection, or even if it doesn't have legal protection, nobody else can really figure out what it is, and it will give you some sustainable advantage. It could be a brand that you've developed, like Apple has now developed. It could be some other manufacturing capabilities that you have. It could be that you over time have developed a locked-in customer base. It's that your product may not be that much better, but because of the way you've set up the pricing model, there's just no way for the customer to get out of continuing to use your platform. It could be because of network effects. If you're familiar with eBay, no one will ever supersede eBay because they've got all the sellers who don't have any place to go and all the buyers who don't have any place to go, and it'd be impossible for anybody to create that network at this point. So they're locked in. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is you need to have attractive economics. It may be great that you have a product or technology that has able to make a significant impact. It may be that you have a sustainable competitive advantage, but if you're not making any money of this, you're not going to stay in business and your investors aren't going to continue to support you. If not, your original investors, Wall Street won't continue to support you. And that's an example that, say, Amazon is dealing with right now, which is they've had a significant impact, they've developed a sustainable competitive advantage, and they're making no money. And one of the big questions about Amazon now is how are they going to make money? So anyway, so there are these three things. So we talked about innovation, and innovation, I don't know about in Russia, in the Russian culture, but this is a word in the Western culture that gets thrown around all over the place. And people use innovation like they use the word strategy. You know, it's just like, who knows, we use it all the time, who knows what it really means. It means different things to different people. The best definition of innovation that I've found is change that creates a new dimension of performance. So it has to be new and different from the past. It makes an impact, and it's purposeful. It has a purpose to it. And it's really important that you're thinking about what is the purpose as you're thinking about what it is that you're creating that's new and different. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but Procter & Gamble, which is a big global company, has thought a lot about this as they think about their own innovation internally. And they think about 4 types of innovation. Not all innovation is a brand new product that nobody has ever seen. There's a lot of innovation that happens on a day-to-day basis in big companies that is innovation that helps them sustain their existing businesses. And one way to think about it is benefits, better, easier, cheaper. And those things are really important. Those innovations are really important. So even for a new product, like your products, if you can say, this helps you do something easier, cheaper, faster, and sustain your business, that could be a very important innovation. The second one is there are certain things that are not technology-based at all. They're what you might think of as commercial innovations. So for example, marketing innovations, packaging innovations, and promotion innovations. For example, what P&G did at the Winter Olympics in the last couple of Olympics with their advertising. Their third category of innovation is what they call transformational sustaining, where they reframe existing categories by bringing order magnitude improvements into new product or service categories. And then the fourth one is where you're truly disrupting a market by bringing new to the world business, new to the world product service offering into the world. I think I'm going to skip this about capabilities at this point and get right on to this ROFE, return on funds employed. As I said, a P&L, a product and loss statement, your fundamental accounting, is not the economics of the business. The way to think about the business, and what DuPont figured out about 100 years ago, is to think about how the different pieces of the P&L statement, the sales, the selling expense, the delivery expense, the administrative expense, add up to costs down at the bottom. Right there, okay? And then you've got your sales, so that then gives you earnings, divided by sales gives you return on sales. And then think about the balance sheet. So you've got all these different working capital assets, inventories, accounts receivable, cash, adds up to working capital. And then you've got your fixed assets, your permanent investment is your total investment. The sales divided by that gives you your turnover, and the turnover times the earnings as a percentage of sales gives you your return on investment. Now, you may or may not be thinking about your economics in those terms at this point, but your investors are going to be thinking about this. They're going to want to know, how is it exactly that you're making money on this? How does this system work? Now, this is the P&L, or the accounting way of thinking about how the system works. But the other way to think about it is, what are the operating metrics of the business, and how do those work together? So for example, in the airline example, we've got the number of passengers times the average trip length gives you the number of passenger miles. And if we think through all the different costs, the ground operating cost, the flying cost, the maintenance cost, that's the cost per available operating mile times your load factor. If you know anything about airlines, you'll know at these basically that's a yield, how full are your planes. But the point is not to work through this airline example, but to show you that you can think about these economics from either an accounting standpoint or from an operating standpoint. But this is the way to think about it, not by just making a projection of a P&L and a balance sheet. I can't tell you, in business plans that I see, or in these startups that we mentor, they do a 5-year monthly projected P&L, and they say, well, what do you think about that? And I say, well, it's completely made up. You have no idea what your profit's going to be 2 months from now, let alone 5 years from now. You made this up, right? And they go, right. Well, so now let's talk about the economics of your business. How actually does this business make money? That's what I'm talking about when I talk about profit formula. And so once you've thought about your business model, once you've thought about your profit formula, and you need to start communicating that to an investor, John's absolutely right. You've got to hook them about why is it that they ought to be interested in this. But you do very quickly have to get to, okay, what is the unmet customer need? What's your solution and value proposition? How are we going to deliver that proposition? How does that fit with our core capabilities and give us a sustainable competitive advantage? And what are the economics of that? And there's one half of this, which is the strategy dimension, which is, what's the market opportunity, the unmet customer need? What's your proposed offering? What's the value proposition? What's your business model, that we're talking about? And who are your competitors and your competitive advantage? But then there's also the execution dimension, which is, okay, who's the management team? Who's actually going to make this happen? I see you, but who's the rest of your team? Next is, okay, so what's the plan? How are you going to get this into market and test it and see if it works? And what are the financials that I ought to expect out of those plans and that economics, so that I know how much money I have to invest and how long I have to invest it and what I'm going to get out of it. And then, oh, by the way, are there any legal issues? I asked yesterday when we were doing your pitches, Iridium. Iridium, I still think that you can't use that brand name, but it's important to get through some of these legal and regulatory issues before you actually go to the trouble of all the rest of this stuff. And then, are there any ways that you can mitigate these risks? So, for example, if you think that there may be a risk that customers won't actually buy it, is there a way that you can work on that risk? Is there a competitive response that might happen? So we're going to go introduce a tool that competes with, this other software development tool. What if they do A, can we do B? Or if they do B, can we do C? So how can you think ahead to what the problems might be and prevent them ahead of time? And so you've got to get aligned, your strategy, your growth game plan, your shareholders, making sure your shareholders and other stakeholders are all aligned behind this plan, and then make sure that you have the resources lined up to actually go and execute against it. And again, you can read through this afterwards. But the important thing that I try to emphasize with the startups that I've been mentoring in Boston is that this is really a learning experience. And if you think about the old way of doing things was, we've got a business plan, we've identified the market need, we've done our consumer research, we put together a business plan, we've laid out our 5-year monthly P&L and balance sheet, and now I'm going to go raise money, and I've got this plan, and I'm going to go execute the plan. People aren't doing that so much anymore because they've, after seeing what's succeeded and what's failed, not only startups, but in large organizations, they realize that it's really about learning. And this is sort of getting into the lean startup methodology. It's really about taking an approach that is intent on discovering what's out there. Sure, you make hypotheses and you make projections, but you try to understand what are the assumptions that you're making that underlie those projections, and what's a plan that you can develop to test those assumptions to see if you are actually correct, and then you can think about what the investment is that's needed. And so if you think about how does a scientist, many of you are engineers and you have a science background, how do you run an experiment? Well, you're testing you're testing a customer response just as you'd be testing the engineering, the physical properties of a material in an experiment. And so you think like a scientist, you're explicit about these experiments. What actually precisely am I testing? What's my hypothesis? How can I test it? And then as I get results from the marketplace, how do I make decisions based on those results? And then what you find is that as a result of thinking about these experiments and learning and making hypotheses and testing these hypotheses, your strategy emerges as opposed to being just a single thing that you march through. You deliberately develop a strategy and you march through it. No, not so much anymore. You develop some hypotheses, you think about how you're going to test those hypotheses, market, business hypotheses, and then you go to market and you see what customers and suppliers and other partners think and how it really works. And if it works, you keep doing it. And if it doesn't work, you don't do it anymore. Now, the one final thing that I want to talk about is, so you've thought about developing your technology into a product service offering that helps a customer solve a problem, gets a job done. You've thought about how to make that product idea, that technology, into a business by developing your business model, your sustainable competitive advantage, your economics, putting together your go-to-market business plan. But how do you make this into a company? A product is not a company. And this is something else that I find at Mass Challenge and indeed with other startups and businesses and large corporations, which is they developed a technology or product, but they haven't really put it together into a business, a company that can sustain over a long period of time with this team that's based on, not just this strategy, but the people, the rewards that you're giving those people, the culture that you develop, the processes and the structure. And so, again, the strategy is, sort of what emerges out of this business model exploration, but it's the product. It has to do with your winning formula, your success, your formula for success. So it's the products and the services that you offer, the markets that you serve, the value proposition, the sources of a competitive advantage. The people, you really need to start thinking about not just who is your core team that's developing this product and beginning to go to market, but how are you going to develop a broader, stable, a diverse group of people who have the skills. How do you recruit them, select them, rotate them around, promote them, train, develop them? How do you motivate them, not just from a financial standpoint, so it could be their salary, their bonuses, profit sharing, but also what are the other non-financial rewards and punishments, frankly, that you're putting in place to motivate them to do the kinds of things that are in the interest of the overall business. And then taken together, how do you develop that culture? Culture is the unwritten ethos that drives action. So when there aren't policies and procedures in place and there's not a supervisor there to tell a particular team member what to do, the culture is what helps that team member make his or her own decisions. So it's based on the values, the style, the working language that they use together that you have to make sure that is in place as well. And then, of course, you've got to have processes. I'm sure you understand what processes are, and you have structure. So there's and I'm sure you understand what structure is. The physical setup. But all this is driven by the leadership. And then if you have all that put in place, that will help your company have high level of skills, great capabilities, but also the drive or the will to succeed. And those two things taken together is what will drive your performance, the performance of your company. So just to summarize then, when you start thinking over the next couple of days in preparation for our workshop tomorrow on business models, about your business model, ask yourself these questions. And maybe Elena, if we could get this page printed out for people, if we could get this page printed out for people so that everybody has a copy of this page to help guide your thinking for our workshop tomorrow. The first question is, who's your target customer? What's their important problem? What's the job to be done? And where are they located? So this is the part about the hook that John was talking about. Why? What's the why that you're getting at here? And then what's the value proposition? Not only what it is, but what's so special about it? Tell me why it's special. What is it? How's it going to be priced? And why is it a great value? Including not only against competitors who might be in the market, but against somebody who says, you know what, I just don't need this product. I can do without this product. And then third, how are you going to create and deliver that value proposition? Fourth, how do the economics of the business work? Who are your current and potential competitors? And what's your sustainable competitive advantage? So, for example, when we were talking yesterday about the facial recognition software, and there was an example of Aurora, I guess, has much better, or at least somewhat better, facial recognition technology, but they're not a competitor because they're doing it in airports instead of in banks. That doesn't count. They could very easily be a competitor. And so you have to think about your potential competitors as well as your existing competitors. And then what's the plan? How are you going to execute it? How are you going to make this happen? So if we get this printed out and everybody can think through these questions, then we can talk about what your business model is. And then you can start to think about, okay, how are you going to plant the hook in the investor's mouth?
Think about it and give examples.
Yeah.
Not just think about.
Not just think about it. We'll talk about your examples.
Let's be specific, examples.
Your examples.
Your answers to those specific questions.
Yeah.
Or lack of answers, and then the reason why there is no answer. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So that's about business models. Any questions? Does this resonate with you at all? Does this make sense? I apologize if I use some of the Western business school jargon, consulting jargon here, but I'm sure there's the comparable Russian word. I guarantee you there's a comparable Russian acronym for this.
Most probably we're using the same ones.
Same ones, okay.